He swore he would never take a mail-order bride. Said it out loud once, right there on that same wooden platform, like a man carving his name into something permanent. And by the time the train rolled in that morning, everyone in town knew Ethan Cole wasn't the kind of man who could be bought into marriage. The whistle cut through the dry air, long and tired, echoing across the flat land like it had seen too many stops just like this one. Dust lifted in slow spirals as the engine dragged itself to a halt, metal groaning, wheels settling into silence. People gathered the way they always did when something new arrived, half curious, half hoping for trouble. But Ethan stayed back under the shade of the general store awning, leaning against a post, hat tipped low enough to keep the sun out of his eyes and the world at a distance. He wasn't looking for anything. Not anymore. The doors opened with a sharp clang, and one by one, passengers stepped down. Travelers, traders, a family with too many bags and not enough smiles. But then she appeared, and something in the air shifted so quietly most folks didn't even notice it at first. She stepped down alone. No escort, no trunk, just a small cloth bag hanging from her hand like it didn't weigh much, but meant everything. Her boots touched the platform with a steadiness that didn't match the way her fingers tightened around that bag. And for a moment, she just stood there, eyes scanning the faces like she was searching for someone who had already decided not to come. A breeze moved through, carrying the smell of coal and leather, brushing a loose strand of her dark hair across her cheek. And that's when Ethan saw it. The tear. It didn't fall fast. It didn't shake loose like fear. It slid slow, deliberate, like it had taken a long time to earn its way there. He straightened without realizing it, the wood creaking softly behind him, his attention pulled in despite every reason he had to look away. That's her, ain't it? Someone muttered nearby, voice thick with amusement. Mail order bride. A few chuckles followed, low and easy. The kind that came from people who'd already decided what a person was worth before hearing a single word from them. She didn't react, didn't lower her head, didn't defend herself, just stood there, still as a fence post under the open sky, holding that bag and whatever story was folded inside it. The station master glanced at his clipboard, frowning like something didn't line up, but no one stepped forward to claim her. Not a husband, not a name, just silence stretching longer than it should. Ethan pushed himself off the post before he could talk himself out of it, boots tapping once, twice against the planks as he moved closer, not too fast, not drawing attention, just enough to see her face clearly. Up close, the tear had already dried against her skin, leaving no trace but the memory of it. Her eyes didn't meet his. They stayed fixed somewhere past him, like she was measuring distance instead of people. Then she shifted her grip, and for a split second, something slipped from the edge of that cloth bag. A corner of paper, creased, worn, marked with a seal pressed deep enough to leave an imprint even in the dust. Ethan caught that detail before it disappeared again, and something about it didn't belong in a place like this. Not with her. Not with the way the wind picked up just then, carrying with it a sound from beyond the tracks, faint but steady, like hooves striking hard ground miles away. Most didn't hear it. Ethan did. And for the first time in a long while, he felt that old instinct stir, the one that said whatever just stepped off that train wasn't here by accident, and whatever was coming behind it wasn't far enough to ignore. The sound came again, clearer this time, steady and deliberate. Not the scattered rhythm of a lone traveler, but something measured, something that moved with purpose, and Ethan felt it settle in his chest before anyone else seemed to notice. A quiet warning carried through the ground more than the air. The girl did not turn toward it. That was the first thing that struck him as wrong. Anyone else would have looked, would have followed the sound with their eyes, searching for safety or danger, but she stayed still, her gaze fixed forward, as if whatever was coming was not a surprise to her at all. The station master cleared his throat, flipping through his papers again, confusion growing more obvious with each passing second. Name? He asked, not looking up at first, then finally meeting her eyes when she did not answer. She hesitated just long enough for the silence to stretch thin. Ayana, she said softly, her voice carrying a weight that did not belong to someone standing alone on a dusty platform. The name did not land easily in the ears of the people around them. A few exchanged looks. Someone muttered under their breath. Ethan watched the way she held herself, shoulders straight but not rigid, like someone who had learned to stand firm long before she had any reason to trust the ground beneath her feet. "You got a husband waiting?" the station master asked, trying to keep his tone light, but the question hung heavier than intended. She shook her head once. No explanation. No apology. Just the truth, plain and unguarded. A ripple moved through the small crowd, not loud, but enough. Doubt turned into judgment the way it always did in places like this. Ethan felt it shift, felt the weight of it settle around her like dust after a storm. He took another step forward before he fully decided to, his boots sounding louder now that the platform had gone quiet. "She said she does not," he said, his voice calm, not raised, but enough to cut through the murmurs. The station master looked relieved to have someone else speak, nodding quickly. "Then there has been a mistake," he said, tapping the paper again. "No one by that name is registered for pickup." The word pickup did not sit right with Ethan, but he did not comment on it. Not yet. Ayanna lowered her eyes briefly, not in shame, but in thought, like she was measuring something unseen. Then she reached into that cloth bag again, slower this time, and pulled out the folded paper Ethan had glimpsed earlier. Up close, he could see the seal more clearly now, pressed deep into the surface, marked with patterns he did not recognize but felt carried meaning beyond simple ink. She held it out, not to the station master, but to Ethan. That alone made a few heads turn. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then took it, the paper rough, against his fingers, heavier than it should have been. "Read it," she said quietly. He almost told her he could not, almost handed it back without trying, but something in her tone stopped him. Not a command, not a plea, just certainty. He unfolded it slowly, the creases resisting at first, as if the paper had been opened and closed too many times already. The markings inside were not English, at least not in any way he could make sense of, but there were numbers, distances, and a symbol repeated more than once near the bottom, the same symbol stamped into the seal. He felt eyes on him, waiting for him to explain something he did not yet understand. "What is it?" someone asked from behind him. Ethan did not answer. Instead, he glanced back toward the open land beyond the tracks, and this time, the sound was no longer distant. It was close enough that even the others began to hear it, turning one by one, conversations dying mid-sentence. The air shifted again, not with wind this time, but with expectation. Ayanna did not move. Not a single step. "You hear it now," she said, almost to herself, and there was no fear in her voice. Only the quiet acceptance of something already set in motion. Ethan folded the letter carefully, slower than before, and kept it in his hand instead of giving it back. Whatever this was, whatever had followed her here, it was not something that ended with a mistake on a piece of paper. And for reasons he could not yet explain, he had already chosen not to step away. The first rider appeared through the rising dust like a shadow pulled slowly into shape, his horse moving at a controlled pace that spoke of distance already traveled and more yet to come. And behind him the others followed in a line that stretched farther than the eye could measure at first glance. Not rushing, not scattered, but steady, deliberate, as if each step had been decided long before this town ever came into view. Conversations stopped without needing to be told. The sound of boots shifting on wooden planks, the faint creak of leather, even the wind seemed to pull back and wait. Ethan did not move from where he stood, the folded letter still in his hand, its edges pressing into his palm like it was reminding him of something he had not yet understood. Ayanna finally turned her head, not toward the crowd, not toward the station master, but toward the riders, and for the first time since she stepped off that train, there was something different in her expression. Not fear, not relief, recognition. The lead rider slowed his horse 20 yards from the platform, reins drawn gently, the animal settling into stillness as if it understood the moment carried weight beyond movement. The others followed suit, forming a quiet line behind him, their presence filling the open space with something that could not be measured in numbers alone. No one reached for a weapon. No one spoke. The silence stretched again, thicker this time, pressing against the ears of every person standing there. Ethan glanced down at the letter once more, then back up at the riders, his jaw tightening slightly as he tried to fit the pieces together. "You brought this with you," he said under his breath, not quite a question. Ayanna's eyes did not leave the lead rider. "No," she said quietly. "It brought me." The words settled between them, strange and certain at the same time. The lead rider finally dismounted, boots touching the ground with a soft thud that carried farther than it should have, and he began to walk forward, each step measured, unhurried, his gaze fixed not on the crowd, but on Ethan, then shifting briefly to the letter in his hand. Ethan felt that look like a weight, not threatening, but precise, as if he were being placed into a story he had not agreed to join. The man stopped a few feet from the platform, close enough now that the details became clear, the lines on his face shaped by years that had not been easy, the calm in his posture something earned, not given. He did not speak immediately. Instead, his eyes moved once more to Ayanna, and in that single glance, something passed between them that did not need words. Respect, understanding, perhaps something older than both. Then, without warning, the man lowered himself onto one knee. It happened so smoothly, it almost seemed like part of the ground itself had shifted to meet him. A breath, caught somewhere in the crowd. Then another rider followed. Then another. One by one, each man dismounted and stepped forward just enough to lower themselves in the same way, until the line that had once stretched across the open land now formed a quiet arc of stillness facing the platform. No orders had been given. No signal had been called. It simply happened, as natural as the sun rising over the horizon. Ethan stood there, the letter still in his hand, feeling the world tilt slightly beneath a truth he had not expected. These were not men who had come to claim something. They had come to acknowledge it. He looked at Ayanna again, really looked this time, and saw what he had missed before, not a lost woman, not someone abandoned, but someone carrying a weight that others recognized even from miles away. "You knew," he said, his voice lower now, quieter. She nodded once. "I hoped." The difference between those two things hung in the air, subtle but undeniable. Ethan exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to let something else take its place, something steadier. He unfolded the letter again, this time not to understand it, but to accept that it did not need to be understood to matter. And for the first time since the train had arrived, he realized that whatever path had brought her here had not ended on this platform. It had only just begun, and somehow, without meaning to, he was already standing in the middle of it. No one in that town had ever seen something like that, not in daylight, not without a word spoken, and certainly not without a single hand reaching for a weapon. Yet there they were, men who could have filled the horizon with fear, instead choosing silence, instead choosing respect. And that alone shifted something deep in the bones of every person standing on that platform. Ethan did not move at first, not because he was frozen, but because he understood instinctively that this moment did not belong to motion. It belonged to stillness, to the kind of quiet that demanded attention rather than noise. The letter in his hand felt heavier now, not in weight, but in meaning, like it had crossed more distance than the train tracks beneath his boots could ever measure. He glanced once more at the man kneeling closest, studying the calm in his face, the steadiness in his breathing, and realized this was not submission. This was something else entirely, something chosen, something deliberate. Ayanna stepped forward then, just one step, but it carried farther than any speech could have, the movement drawing every eye back to her without effort. She did not rush to them. She did not run. She simply closed the small distance between where she had stood alone and where she now stood acknowledged, and in that space, the difference between who she appeared to be and who she truly was began to unfold without a single explanation. The lead rider lowered his head slightly, not in weakness, but in recognition, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried across the platform in a tone that did not need volume to be heard. "You have returned," he said, each word measured, each one landing with quiet certainty. Ayanna nodded once, her eyes steady now, no longer searching, no longer uncertain. "I was sent away," she replied, and there was no anger in it, only truth. The words stirred something in the crowd, confusion mixing with the fading traces of earlier judgment, as if the story they thought they understood had slipped through their fingers and left them holding nothing but assumption. Ethan remained where he was, close enough to hear, close enough to feel the shift, but far enough to understand that this exchange was not meant for him, and yet somehow, he was still part of it. The lead rider's gaze moved to him again, slower this time, more deliberate, and for a brief moment, the space between them felt like a question waiting to be answered. "You stood," the man said, Not as praise, not as accusation, simply as fact. Ethan considered the words, then gave a slight nod. Nothing more. Seemed right. He answered, his voice even, as if the decision had cost him nothing, though something in his chest said otherwise. The man studied him a moment longer, then inclined his head once, a gesture small enough to be missed by most, but not by Ethan. Behind them, the others began to rise, not all at once, but one by one. The movement spreading through the line like a quiet ripple across still water, and as they stood, the space they occupied did not shrink. It expanded, filling the air with a presence that no longer felt distant or unknown. Ayanna turned slightly, her gaze moving over the town, over the faces that had laughed, questioned, judged, and now watched in silence. And there was no bitterness in her expression, no need to answer what had already revealed itself. She reached out then, not toward the riders, but toward Ethan, her hand open, waiting. He hesitated only a moment before placing the letter back into her palm, the exchange simple, but carrying more weight than the paper itself. She folded it carefully, the same deliberate motion as before, and slipped it back into her bag, as if returning something sacred to its place. "You can leave with them," Ethan said quietly, not asking, not assuming, just offering the path that seemed most obvious. Ayanna looked at him then, truly looked this time, and a faint, almost imperceptible shift crossed her face, something softer, something that did not belong to the distance she had carried before. "I could," she said, her voice steady, "but that is not why I came." The words settled between them, unexpected, and for the first time since the train had arrived, Ethan felt the ground beneath him change in a way he could not quite name, as if the line he had drawn long ago had just been stepped over, not by force, not by demand, but by something far quieter and far harder to turn away from. The words lingered longer than they should have, settling into the quiet like dust that refused to fall, and Ethan found himself studying her again, not the way a man looks at a stranger, but the way he looks at something that does not fit into the shape of the world he thought he understood. "Then why are you here?" he asked, his voice lower now, not pressing, just asking for a truth he had already begun to suspect would not come easy. Ayanna did not answer right away. She turned slightly, her gaze drifting past him toward the far edge of town where the land opened wide and empty, where the wind carried no walls and no expectations. For a moment, she looked like she belonged there instead of here, like the platform beneath her boots was only a pause, not a destination. "Because someone here made a promise," she said finally, her voice steady, each word placed with care, and though she did not look at him when she said it, something in the way the words landed made Ethan feel as if they had been meant for him all along. He frowned slightly, searching his memory for something that matched, but nothing came. He had made promises in his life, sure, but none that would call a woman like her across miles of open land and into a town that had already decided she did not belong. "You got the wrong man," he said after a moment, not harsh, just certain. Ayanna's eyes shifted back to him, and this time there was something in them that had not been there before, not doubt, not fear, but a quiet knowing that did not ask for agreement. "Do I?" she replied, and it was not a challenge, not even a question, just a statement that left no room for easy answers. Behind them, the riders remained where they stood, not interrupting, not urging, simply waiting, their presence a reminder that whatever this moment was, it stretched beyond the two people standing on that platform. The lead rider stepped forward then, just enough to close the space between him and Ethan by a few feet, his movements slow, respectful, but deliberate. "The letter you hold," he said, his voice calm, "was not written for you to read. It was written for you to receive." Ethan glanced down at his empty hand, realizing only then that he had already given it back, that whatever claim he thought he had to understanding it had never really been his to begin with. "I did not ask for it," he said, and there was a trace of something else in his tone now, not resistance, but hesitation, like a man who could feel the edge of something he was not sure he wanted to step over. The rider nodded once. "No," he said simply, "but you did not refuse it. That landed differently." Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting out toward the open land for a moment before returning to Ayanna. The town behind him remained silent, watching, waiting, but no one stepped forward now, no one laughed, No one questioned. The moment had moved beyond them. If there is something you need, Ethan said, choosing his words carefully, you can say it plain. Ayana held his gaze, and for the first time since she arrived, the distance in her expression softened just enough to let something else through, something human, something tired, something real. I do not need protection, she said quietly. I need a place that will not turn away from me. The simplicity of it cut deeper than any long explanation could have, and Ethan felt it settle somewhere he had kept closed for a long time. He glanced back at the town, at the buildings worn by sun and years, at the people who had already shown what they would choose when given the chance, and then back at her. That depends, he said, his voice steady again, on what follows you. Ayana did not look at the riders this time. She looked at him. Not what, she said. Who? The word carried weight, quiet but undeniable, and before Ethan could ask more, before the moment could stretch any further, a new sound rose from beyond the edge of town, different from the steady approach that had come before, sharper, closer, and not carried by patience but by urgency. And for the first time since the riders had arrived, something shifted again in the air, something that suggested this story was not finished revealing itself, not yet. The new sound cut through the stillness like a blade through cloth, sharper, faster, and without the patience that had defined everything up until that moment. And every head turned toward it before anyone could stop themselves, the instinct too old to ignore. Ethan felt it before he saw it, that shift in rhythm, that difference in intent, and his eyes narrowed slightly as he stepped half a pace forward without thinking, placing himself just enough between Ayana and the direction the sound was coming from. This time, she did react. Not with fear, not with panic, but with something closer to recognition layered with concern, the kind that does not belong to a stranger, but to someone who understands exactly what is approaching and what it means. The riders who had knelt only moments ago did not return to their knees, but they did not reach for anything either. Instead, they turned as one, their attention shifting outward, their formation subtly adjusting, not to surround, not to trap, but to stand as a line between what had already arrived and what was now closing in. Dust rose again at the far edge of town, thicker this time, less controlled, and within it shapes began to form, moving faster, less measured, their approach carrying urgency that could not be mistaken for ceremony. Ethan glanced sideways at Ayana. Friends of yours? He asked quietly, though he already knew the answer would not be simple. She shook her head once, slow, deliberate. No, she said. Not friends. The word hung there, heavier than anything that had been said before, and Ethan felt his jaw tighten just slightly as he shifted his weight, not preparing for a fight, but preparing to stand, the way he had already chosen once without fully understanding why. The lead rider stepped forward again, placing himself slightly ahead of the others, his posture unchanged, his calm unbroken, but his presence now carried something more, not tension, but readiness, the kind that does not need to be announced. You should step back, he said to Ethan, not as an order, but as a consideration. Ethan did not move. She said she needed a place that would not turn her away. He replied, his voice even, and I have not changed my mind. The rider studied him for a moment, then gave a slight nod, not approving, not objecting, simply acknowledging the choice. Behind them, the second group of riders broke through the edge of town, their horses slowing as they approached the platform, their numbers smaller but their energy sharper, their eyes scanning quickly, landing on Ayana almost immediately. They did not dismount. They did not kneel. They remained in their saddles, the space between the two groups now charged with something that could not be named, but could be felt in every breath. Ayana stepped forward then, moving past Ethan before he could stop her, her posture straight, her gaze steady as she faced the new arrivals. You followed me, she said, her voice carrying clearly despite its quiet tone. One of the men in the front leaned slightly forward in his saddle, his expression unreadable from a distance, but his focus unmistakable. You were not meant to leave, he answered, his words measured, not raised, but firm enough to carry. Ethan felt something shift at that, not in the air, but in the understanding of what this truly was. Not a chase for possession, not a simple claim, something deeper, something tied to choice. Ayana did not step back. I was not meant to stay, she replied, and the calm in her voice did more than any threat could have. The space between the two groups held, neither side advancing, neither side retreating, and Ethan stood just behind her, close enough to step forward if needed, far enough to let her speak her own truth. The wind picked up again, brushing past the platform, carrying dust, carrying silence, carrying the weight of decisions that had not yet been made but were already shaping the moment. And for the first time since all of this began, Ethan understood that whatever came next would not be decided by strength or numbers, but by something far quieter, something that could not be taken, only given, and once given, could not be taken back. The silence stretched tighter than before, pulled thin between two lines of men who had not come for the same reason, and yet now stood facing each other, as if the land itself had drawn a boundary no one had spoken out loud. Ethan watched the way Ayanna held her ground, not shifting, not retreating, her hands relaxed at her sides, but her presence steady in a way that made the space around her feel anchored, as if everything else moved while she remained fixed. The second group of riders did not dismount, their horses restless beneath them, hooves shifting against the dirt, their impatience carried in the small movements they did not bother to hide. The man at their front leaned slightly forward again, his eyes narrowing as he studied her, then flicking briefly toward Ethan, measuring him, placing him, deciding something without asking. "You were given a place," he said, his tone controlled, but lacking the quiet respect that had marked the others. "You chose to walk away from it." Ayanna did not flinch. "I was given a path," she corrected, her voice calm, "not a place." The distinction seemed small, but it landed with weight, and even Ethan felt it settle, understanding that one meant belonging, while the other meant direction without choice. The man exhaled through his nose, a faint sound, not quite frustration, not quite disbelief. "You carry something that is not yours to decide," he said, his gaze dropping briefly to the bag at her side. "That letter binds more than you understand." Ethan felt his eyes move there as well, to the cloth bag, to the folded paper inside that had already shifted the ground beneath his feet once today. He did not reach for it. He did not ask. He simply stood, listening, the way a man does when he knows speaking too soon would cost more than silence. Ayanna's hand moved, not to hide the bag, but to rest lightly against it, as if acknowledging its presence without surrendering it. "It was given," she said, "not taken." The lead rider from the first group stepped forward again, placing himself just slightly closer to her side, not blocking, not claiming, but standing in a way that said he recognized the weight of what she carried without needing to take it from her. "And what is given can be refused," he added quietly, his voice steady, his eyes never leaving the man on horseback. That seemed to shift something, not in the air, but in the understanding of it. The second rider straightened in his saddle, his posture tightening just enough to reveal that this was not the answer he had expected. "Refused," he repeated, as if testing the word against something he had always believed unchangeable. "That is not how this works." Ethan felt something in that statement, something rigid, something that had never been questioned before, and he found himself speaking before he fully planned to. "Maybe it is," he said, his voice calm, cutting through the space without rising. The rider's gaze snapped to him fully now, sharper, more focused. "This does not concern you," the man replied. Ethan held that look without flinching. "She said she needed a place that would not turn her away," he answered, "and last I checked, this ground does not belong to you." The words were not aggressive, not loud, but they landed firm, and for a moment, the space between them shifted again, not toward conflict, but towards something else, something that had not been considered before. Ayanna glanced at Ethan then, just briefly, and in that glance there was something new, something quieter than gratitude, deeper than acknowledgement, something that did not need to be named to be understood. The wind moved through again, carrying the scent of dust and distance, brushing past all of them as if reminding each person standing there that this moment was larger than any single claim. The rider on horseback looked from Ethan back to Ayanna, then to the line of men who stood behind her, those who had chosen to kneel, those who had chosen to stand without force, and something in his expression shifted, not in defeat, not in surrender, but in realization. "Then you will answer for that choice," he said finally, his voice quieter now, less certain than before. Ayanna did not step back. "I already have," she replied, and the calm in her tone carried more weight than any argument could have. leaving the next move hanging not in the hands of those who had come to take, but in the silence that followed, where something deeper than authority had begun to take shape. The words settled like dust after a long ride, slow and heavy, and no one moved right away because everyone felt it. That shift from something that could be decided by force into something that had already been decided by choice. Ethan stood where he was, not reaching for anything, not stepping forward or back, just holding the line he had drawn without meaning to draw it. And he could feel the weight of eyes on him, not just from the riders, but from the town behind him. People who had started the day with laughter and now stood silent, watching a story they did not understand unfold without their permission. The rider on horseback let the silence stretch, his gaze moving again between Ayanna and Ethan, then to the men who had stood with her, and something in his posture shifted, not loosening, not tightening, but adjusting, like a man recalculating a path he had always believed was straight. "You speak as if the choice is yours alone," he said finally, his voice quieter now, the sharp edge dulled by something he could not quite hide. Ayanna did not look away. "It always was," she answered, and there was no pride in it, no defiance, just a truth that had been waiting longer than this moment to be spoken. The wind moved through again, carrying the dry scent of the plains, brushing against coats and hats and the edges of a town that had suddenly grown smaller without changing its size. Ethan glanced briefly at the lead rider beside Ayanna, the one who had knelt first, and saw something there that matched what he felt. Not relief, not victory, but recognition, like both men understood that whatever came next would not be forced into place. The rider on horseback shifted in his saddle, his horse stepping once, then stilling again, the movement small, but enough to break the stillness just slightly. "If you walk away from this," he said, his eyes fixed on Ayanna, "you walk away from what was prepared for you." Ayanna's hand rested lightly against the bag at her side again, not gripping it, not hiding it, just acknowledging it as part of her without letting it define her. "Then it was never mine," she replied, and the quiet certainty in her voice carried farther than any raised tone could have. Ethan felt something settle in him at that, something that had nothing to do with her past or her people or the letter she carried, but everything to do with the simple fact that she stood there and chose, even when it would have been easier not to. The rider's gaze held hers a moment longer, then shifted slowly, taking in the line of men who had come with her, the town behind Ethan, the open land beyond, and for the first time since he arrived, he did not look like a man certain of his ground. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something he could not command. "And if the cost follows you," he said, not as a threat now, but as a warning that had lost its force. Ayanna's expression did not change. "Then it will follow me," she answered, "not the place that takes me in." The distinction settled deeper than anything else that had been said, and Ethan felt it land in the space between him and the man on horseback, a line drawn not in dirt, but in understanding. The lead rider beside Ayanna inclined his head slightly, not toward the man on horseback, but toward Ethan, a gesture so small most would miss it, but Ethan did not, and in it he read something simple and clear: "This is your moment to choose." The town behind him remained silent, waiting, watching, but no one stepped forward, no one spoke, because whatever decision was about to be made did not belong to them. Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind a man takes when he knows there is no stepping back into who he was before this moment, and he shifted his stance just enough to make it clear, not with words, not with force, but with presence alone, that he was not moving aside. The rider on horseback saw it. Everyone did. The space between them held one last time, stretched thin, balanced on something that could have tipped either way, and then, without a word, the man in the saddle drew his reins gently and turned his horse, not in defeat, not in surrender, but in acceptance of something he could not take. The others followed, one by one, their departure as controlled as their arrival, until the dust began to settle again and the sound of their horses faded into the distance. No one spoke, not at first, because what had just happened did not need explanation. It needed time. Ayanna stood where she was, the tension easing from her shoulders in a way so slight it could only be seen if someone was looking closely, and Ethan realized he was. He glanced at her, then out at the open land, then back again, and after a moment he spoke, his voice quiet, steady, carrying only as far as it needed to. "You still need that place," he said. Ayanna met his eyes, and this time, there was no distance left in hers. Yes, she answered simply. And Ethan nodded once, the decision already made before the words ever came. The dust had barely settled when the town began to breathe again, slow at first, like it had forgotten how, and Ethan could feel it in the shifting of boots behind him, in the quiet murmur that tried to return but never quite found its voice. No one stepped forward to question him now. No one laughed. The moment had changed something, not loud, not dramatic, but permanent in a way that would linger long after the tracks went quiet again. Ayanna remained where she stood for a few seconds more, her eyes following the horizon where the riders had disappeared, not with regret, not with doubt, but with the calm of someone who had closed a door that had been open too long. Then she turned back, not to the crowd, not to the platform, but to Ethan, and for the first time since she arrived, there was no distance left between what she carried and what she showed. Where? She asked, her voice steady, simple, as if the question held no weight beyond the word itself. But Ethan knew better. He glanced toward the town, toward the line of buildings worn by sun and years, each one holding stories that did not often welcome new ones. Then past them, out toward the open land where his place stood, a few miles out, quiet, removed, untouched by the kind of noise that filled streets like this. It is not much, he said after a moment, and it is not close. Ayanna gave a slight nod, as if that was exactly what she expected. That is enough, she replied. Ethan studied her for a second longer, then shifted his weight and turned toward the hitching post, where his horse stood tied, calm as ever, as if none of this had been out of the ordinary. He untied the reins slowly, his movements deliberate, giving the town time to speak if it was going to, but no one did. The station master looked down at his papers, pretending to find something that was not there. A few others turned away, suddenly interested in anything but what had just happened in front of them. Ethan led the horse forward, stopping beside Ayanna, offering the reins without a word. She did not take them. Instead, she stepped closer to the animal, her hand brushing lightly along its neck, her touch gentle, familiar, and the horse responded without hesitation, lowering its head slightly, accepting her presence as if it had known her longer than a few seconds. Ethan noticed that. He noticed a lot of things now that he had not before. You ride, he said, more observation than question. Ayanna nodded once. I travel, she corrected softly, and there was something in that distinction that made Ethan almost smile, though he did not let it show. He mounted first, then extended a hand down to her, not as a demand, not as a claim, just as an offer. She looked at it for a brief moment, then placed her hand in his, her grip steady, and let him pull her up behind him, settling into place with a quiet ease that spoke of balance, of knowing how to move without taking more space than needed. For a second, neither of them spoke. The town remained behind them, watching, but no longer part of what came next. Ethan adjusted the reins, then paused, glancing slightly over his shoulder. Once we leave, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, there is no turning back to what was here. Ayanna did not hesitate. I already left that, she answered. The simplicity of it settled between them, and Ethan gave a small nod, more to himself than to her, before nudging the horse forward. The wooden platform creaked behind them as they moved, the sound fading quickly into the rhythm of hooves on packed dirt, steady, unhurried, carrying them away from the town and into the open stretch of land beyond. The wind met them there, stronger, cleaner, free of walls and whispers, and Ethan felt something shift again, not around him, but within him, like a line he had drawn years ago had finally been crossed without force, without regret. Behind him, he could feel Ayanna's presence, steady, quiet, and for the first time since this day began, the road ahead did not feel empty. It felt like it was waiting. The town disappeared behind them quicker than Ethan expected, swallowed by distance and the slow rise of land that seemed to erase anything a man might want to leave behind. And for a while neither of them spoke, the only sound the steady rhythm of hooves pressing into the dry earth, each step carrying them farther from what had been decided and closer to something neither of them had fully named yet. The air felt different out here, wider, less crowded, and Ethan found himself breathing a little deeper without meaning to, his shoulders easing in a way he had not noticed they had been tight before. He kept his eyes forward, scanning the horizon the way habit had taught him, but his awareness stretched behind him too, to the quiet presence seated just inches away, steady, balanced, as if she had always known how to ride with another without disturbing the rhythm. After a mile or so, he spoke, not turning, his voice carrying just enough over the wind. "That letter," he said. "You said it was given." Ayanna did not answer right away, and for a moment, Ethan thought she might choose silence, but then he felt her shift slightly, not closer, not farther, just enough to signal she had heard him. "It was," she said, her tone calm, "but not in the way they meant." Ethan frowned slightly, considering that. "Meaning," he pressed gently. "Meaning it was not meant to bind me," she replied. "It was meant to find me." The distinction settled slowly, like everything else about her words, and Ethan let it sit there without rushing to understand it. They rode on another stretch in silence, the land rolling out in long, open lines, broken only by scattered brush and the occasional fence post leaning slightly from years of wind. The sun had climbed higher now, warming the backs of their shoulders, and Ethan reached up once to adjust the brim of his hat, more out of habit than need. "You knew they would come," he said after a while. Ayanna nodded behind him, the motion subtle but certain. "Yes. And you still came," he added. This time, there was the faintest hint of something in her voice when she answered, not hesitation, but something closer to reflection. "There are places you go because you are told," she said, "and there are places you go because you choose." Ethan let out a quiet breath at that, not quite a laugh, not quite agreement, just recognition. He had spent most of his life moving between those two, without ever putting words to it. The land ahead began to shift again, the gentle rise leveling out into a stretch he knew well, and in the distance, the outline of his place came into view, small against the open sky, nothing more than a simple structure with a fence line that marked its boundary more by habit than necessity. He slowed the horse slightly, giving the moment time to settle before they reached it. "That is it," he said, nodding ahead. Ayanna leaned just enough to see past him, her gaze taking in the shape of it, the distance between it, and anything else, the quiet that surrounded it. She did not speak right away. Ethan felt her taking it in, measuring it in a way that had nothing to do with size or comfort. "It is far," she said finally. "That was the point," Ethan replied, a hint of something softer in his tone now. They closed the remaining distance at an easy pace, the fence coming into clearer view, the gate slightly off center the way it always had been. Ethan guided the horse through, then dismounted, landing lightly on the ground before turning to offer his hand again. Ayanna took it without hesitation, stepping down with the same steady balance she had shown from the beginning. For a moment, they stood there, just outside the door, the wind moving softly around them, carrying the quiet of the place like something shared. Ethan glanced at the house, then back at her. "It is not much," he said again, but this time there was less explanation in it, more acceptance. Ayanna looked at the structure, then at the land beyond it, then finally back at him, and the faintest trace of something warmer touched her expression. "It does not need to be," she said. And for the first time since the train arrived, Ethan believed her. The door creaked softly as Ethan pushed it open, the sound carrying into the stillness of the place like it had been waiting for someone to return, and for a moment neither of them stepped inside, both standing just at the threshold, as if crossing it meant more than simply entering a room. The air inside held the quiet weight of a place lived in alone, simple, ordered, everything where it needed to be and nothing more, a life shaped by routine rather than welcome. Ethan stepped in first, not out of habit, but out of a quiet instinct to show the space before asking anything of it, his boots brushing dust from the floor as he moved aside, giving her room without making it a gesture. Ayanna followed without hesitation, her eyes taking in the room slowly, not searching for comfort, not judging what was there or missing, just observing, as if understanding the story of a place mattered more than its size. The light came in through the single window, cutting across the wooden table and the worn chair beside it, settling in a line that marked the passage of time more than any clock could. She moved a few steps in, her hand brushing lightly along the edge of the table, her touch careful, not claiming, just acknowledging. Ethan watched that, the way she entered without disturbing the balance of things, and something in him eased, something he had not known had been holding tight since the moment she stepped off that train. "Water is out back," he said after a moment, his voice low, steady, filling the quiet without breaking it. "There is food, not much, but enough." Ayana nodded once, her attention shifting toward the window, toward the land beyond it, and for a second, Ethan thought she might step right back outside, might choose the open space over the walls he had built around himself for years. But she did not. Instead, she set her bag gently on the table, the cloth folding under its own weight, and stood there, her hand resting on it, as if deciding something. Ethan leaned lightly against the doorframe, giving her the time without saying so, his eyes drifting briefly to the bag, to the letter inside that had carried them both here in ways neither had planned. "You can keep it," he said quietly, not looking directly at her. "Whatever it is, it stays with you." Ayana's fingers tightened slightly against the fabric, then relaxed. "It was never meant to be kept," she said, her voice soft but certain. That made him look at her. "Then why bring it this far?" he asked. She lifted the bag slowly, unfolding the top, and reached inside, pulling out the letter with the same careful motion he had seen before, but this time there was no hesitation, no weight in the act, only clarity. She stepped toward the window, where the light fell strongest, and held the paper there, letting the sun pass through it, revealing markings that had been hidden in shadow before. Ethan straightened slightly, watching as shapes appeared within the page, lines that connected, patterns that made sense only when seen this way. "It is not a message," she said, her eyes following the lines as they came into view. "It is a path." Ethan stepped closer, not too close, just enough to see what she saw, the faint outlines forming something that resembled distance, direction, something that stretched beyond the boundaries of his land. "And it ends here," he said slowly, the realization coming not from the marks themselves, but from the way she held them. Ayana shook her head gently. "No," she replied. "It begins here." The difference settled between them, quiet but undeniable, and for a moment the room felt larger than it was, as if the walls had shifted to make space for something neither of them had expected to carry. Ethan glanced out the window, following the direction of the light, of the lines she had revealed, and saw the land differently now, not just as something he worked and lived on, but as something connected to a story he had just stepped into. He looked back at her, at the letter, at the way she stood there without doubt, and something in him made a decision before he had time to question it. "Then we start here," he said, his voice steady, not asking, not offering, just stating what had already become true. Ayana lowered the letter slowly, her gaze meeting his, and for the first time since any of this began, there was something close to peace in her expression, not because the journey was over, but because it had finally found its ground. The light through the window shifted slowly as the afternoon leaned toward evening, stretching longer across the floor, touching the edges of the room like it was marking something that had changed without asking permission. Ethan stood there for a moment after he spoke, feeling the weight of his own words settle into place, not heavy, not uncertain, just final in a way that did not need repeating. Ayana watched him, her eyes steady, searching not for doubt but for truth, and whatever she found there seemed to answer something she had carried far longer than the journey that brought her here. She folded the letter once more, but this time the motion was different, not careful out of caution, but deliberate out of understanding, like a map no longer needed to be studied because the ground beneath her feet had already confirmed it. She placed it on the table instead of returning it to her bag, leaving it in the open where the light could still touch it, where it could be seen, not hidden, not protected. Ethan noticed that and did not comment, but he understood it. Some things were not meant to be carried anymore once they had done their work. Outside, the wind moved across the land in long, low currents, brushing against the fence, stirring the dust in quiet patterns that rose and fell without urgency. And for the first time since the riders had come and gone, the world felt still in a way that did not carry tension. Ayana stepped toward the door then, pushing it open again, letting the outside air flow through the room, and she stood there looking out across the land, not as someone passing through, but as someone deciding where to stand. Ethan followed her to the doorway, stopping just behind her, not crowding the space, not taking it, just sharing it. "You said it begins here," he said after a moment, his voice low, carrying only as far as it needed to. Ayana nodded slightly, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the light softened against the edges of the earth. "Not the journey," she replied. "That already happened." Ethan frowned faintly at that, not in disagreement, but in thought. "Then what begins?" he asked. She did not answer right away. Instead, she stepped out onto the worn boards of the small porch, the wood creaking softly beneath her weight, and looked out over the stretch of land that belonged to him, or had, until now. "A place that is chosen," she said finally, and the words carried something deeper than they first appeared, something that reached beyond land or shelter into something more lasting. Ethan stepped out beside her, resting his hand lightly against the post, his eyes following hers across the distance, seeing it now not just as acreage or work, but as something that could hold more than one story. "Most people think a place is something you build," he said after a moment. Ayanna shook her head gently. "It is something you allow," she replied. That settled into him in a way he did not expect, quiet but certain, and he found himself nodding slightly, not because he fully understood it, but because part of him recognized it as true. They stood there for a while without speaking, the kind of silence that did not press or demand, but simply existed, filled with the sound of wind and distance and the faint creak of wood adjusting to the cooling air. After a time, Ayanna turned back toward the doorway, her gaze briefly falling on the table where the letter lay, untouched, still catching the last of the light. "It will fade," she said softly. Ethan followed her eyes. "The ink?" he asked. She nodded. "It was never meant to last," she said. "Only to lead." Ethan considered that, then glanced back out across the land once more, letting the idea settle. "Then we do not need it anymore," he said. Ayanna met his eyes again, and there was no hesitation in her expression. "No," she agreed. The simplicity of it carried a kind of finality that did not close anything, but opened something instead, something quieter, something grounded. The sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows across the porch, stretching them out side by side, without separating them, and Ethan realized that for the first time in years, the space beside him did not feel empty, and the silence did not feel like something he had to hold on his own. The last light of the day settled low across the land, stretching long shadows from the porch out into the open field, and neither of them moved to break it, as if both understood that some endings were not meant to be marked by words but by the quiet that followed them. The wind softened as evening approached, carrying a cooler breath that brushed against the wood, the fence, the space between them, and for a moment, everything felt suspended, not waiting, not uncertain, just present in a way that did not ask to be changed. Ethan rested his hand lightly against the post, his gaze moving slowly across the land that had once felt like his alone, and now did not feel smaller, only fuller, like something had been added without taking anything away. Ayanna stood beside him, her posture steady, her attention not fixed on any one place but on the whole of it, as if she was not looking at what it was, but what it could hold. Behind them, inside the small house, the letter remained on the table, still visible in the fading light, its markings already beginning to soften, the edges losing their sharpness as if the purpose it carried had already passed from paper into something less fragile. Neither of them went back for it. Neither of them needed to. "It will be gone by morning," Ayanna said quietly, her voice blending into the sound of the wind without disturbing it. Ethan nodded once, not turning, his eyes still on the horizon where the sun had nearly slipped away. "Then it did what it came to do," he replied. There was no regret in his tone, no question, just acceptance. Ayanna glanced at him then, and in that glance there was something unspoken but clear, something that did not belong to the road behind them or the people they had left, but to the space they now shared. "Most people hold on longer than they should," she said softly. Ethan let out a quiet breath, something close to a half-smile touching the edge of it, though it never fully formed. "Most people do not know when something is finished," he answered. Ayanna looked back out across the land, her expression calm, her presence settled in a way that did not need to prove itself. "This is not finished," she said. Ethan followed her gaze, taking in the open stretch, the fading light, the quiet that did not feel empty anymore. "No," he agreed after a moment. "It is not." The distinction between ending and beginning no longer felt like a line that needed to be drawn, and that alone changed something in the way the silence sat between them. The first stars began to appear faintly overhead, small at first, then more as the sky deepened, and Ethan found himself noticing them in a way he had not in years, as if the act of sharing the view made it different, made it matter again. He shifted slightly, turning just enough to face her, not fully, not breaking the line of the horizon, but acknowledging her presence without words. "There is room here," he said, his voice steady, simple, not offering more than what was true. Ayanna met his gaze, and this time there was no distance at all, no guarded edge, only a quiet certainty that matched his own. "Then I will stay," she replied. The words did not feel like a request. They did not feel like permission. They felt like something already decided, already understood. Ethan nodded once, and that was enough. No agreement needed to be spoken. No condition needed to be set. The wind moved through again, softer now, carrying the cool of night, and somewhere behind them, inside the house, the letter shifted slightly on the table, the last of its form giving way to time, to purpose fulfilled. Neither of them turned to look. They did not need to. Out here, in the open stretch of land that had once been defined by distance, something else had taken root, something that did not rely on maps or markings or the lines drawn by others. Something chosen, something quiet, something that would not need to be explained to be understood. And as the last light slipped below the horizon, leaving only the steady glow of stars above them, Ethan Cole stood beside her without stepping away, and in that silence, without a single word more, everything that needed to be said had already been spoken.